In the wake of this budget and in the wake of Friday, when it was revealed that the black hole didn't exist, people voluntarily, cabinet ministers, senior ministers, started just getting in touch to say, we feel like we were misled, we're really angry about this. The cabinet itself felt misled by the Chancellor. When you get to the stage where ministers are making very clear that they are unhappy, you're slightly in the end of days territory. Welcome to the State of It, the politics podcast from the Times and the Sunday Times. I'm Stephen Swinford, the political editor of the Times, and we've got a big welcome back this week to Caroline Wheeler, my colleague at the Sunday Times.
Hi everyone, nice to be back.
And Gabriel.
I've always been here. I'm Gabriel Pogrund. I'm the Whitehall editor at the Sunday Times.
Patrick, can you kick us off with that extraordinary conference that you went to at the weekend? Was it fun?
Yeah, I'm recovering from my trip to Liverpool for your party conference. Was it fun? It was certainly very interesting. You know, watching 2,500 people start a new party of the left from scratch. Look, it was a surreal weekend. And it's very easy to say that, listening to those clips, because, you know, these are people who have views that are outside of the Westminster consensus, put it this way. But it was surreal, first and foremost, because it was held in the same venue as Labour Party conference, the ACC, the conference centre on the banks of the Mersey. And walking in on Saturday, I thought for a moment, have the campaign for nuclear disarmament and all of the sort of anti-war activists around Jeremy Corbyn thought the best way to oppose nuclear war, to demonstrate we're against nuclear war, is to reenact the aftermath of one. Because outside, there was nobody there. When you're used to doing this sort of obstacle course of sort of sweaty lobbyists and cabinet ministers and fellow journalists, TV cameras at Labour conference, there was nobody there. And I thought, genuinely, have they cancelled it? And I just haven't realised. Has the civil war between Corbyn and Sultana resulted in its cancellation? But I walked in, and who did I see outside flying against digital ID and a range of other causes, COVID vaccines chief among them, Piers Corbyn. And I thought, well, if Jeremy's brother is outside picketing this conference, I've definitely got the right place. But yeah, it was remarkable, not least because it felt like a Jeremy Corbyn Labour conference in that everybody hated each other. Corbyn got up and gave a sort of hopey, changey speech about good things and bad things, saying, let's not be mean to refugees because tomorrow, favourite line of the conference, this, with very Corbynish specificity, he said, tomorrow they'll be your train drivers. It was all peace and love from Jeremy Corbyn, and then he left the room. Us journalists were ejected from the conference hall, and within 10 seconds, literally everybody was screaming at each other. And that set the tone for the weekend. Zara Sultana boycotted the first day. It was just one of the most vicious but entertaining and in some ways intellectually stimulating events I've ever been to. And you know, by the way, when you're speaking to Jeremy Corbyn's allies, friends, advisors, and they are the right-wing establishment of the party who are loathed by left-wing members in some cases, you think this is the world turned upside down. And I hope they have another one, but I'm not sure they will.
Well, it's not too dissimilar to what's been happening in Westminster. We're going to bring you this week two main topics. We're going to obviously talk about the budget, its really chaotic aftermath and where that leaves Rachel Reeves. And we're also going to be talking more broadly about Brexit, which is back. Listeners will be delighted to hear. And Keir Starmer is kind of trying to go on the front foot about Brexit. But let's start with this. We have now lost the head of the Office of Budget Responsibility. He has fallen on his sword for inadvertently leaking the entire budget on the day of the budget, which is unprecedented in its own right. And we're also in the middle of a kind of big civil war in cabinet, where even cabinet ministers feel that they were misled by the Chancellor when she kept claiming that there was a black hole in the public finances that she needed to fill with tax rises. In fact, as the Office of Budget Responsibility helpfully disclosed on Friday, that black hole did not exist. You've now got Rachel Reeves being called a liar by the Tories. You've got most economists arguing that she did actually at the very least mislead. You've got cabinet ministers who think that she's misleading. And if it wasn't possible for her to be more damaged, well, she is now. She's got lower trust levels than Liz Truss now. She's plummeted off the edge of the polls. And yet it looks like she's going to stick the course for now at least and stay in position.
I keep thinking back to when we were kind of looking into the budget, what was happening. And I kept saying to Steve, and we were talking about this earlier, have they actually said what the black hole is yet? Because in normal circumstances, and I hope I'm not breaking too many journalistic confidences here, there is a moment ahead of the budget where the journalist of choice get a kind of tap on the shoulder and formally sort of briefed off the record about what the size of the black hole was going to be, and it just didn't happen. We knew about the productivity downgrade, but we never knew what the size of the black hole was going to be. And actually it was quite interesting because we were getting all sorts of voices to the contrary. I think Rishi Sunak wrote in the Sunday Times that he didn't actually think that the finances were as bad as Rachel Reeves was painting. He wrote that for us, I think, 3 weeks before the budget came out. There were whispers, and I remember talking to my editor at the Sunday Times a couple of weekends before the budget and said, somebody suggested to me that actually there is only about a £5 billion black hole. As it turned out, there was in fact a surplus.
A 4 billion surplus.
And a lot of journalists are very angry, right? And it's not my job to go
It's
and
all
other
about
journalists.
us, Steve.
Exactly. Politicians are angry, journalists are angry, and it's because they put out half the story. The story that they put out, they did leak one figure. They said that there was a £20 billion downgrade in the public finances that was leaked to the Financial Times. That is a traditional pre-budget leak. The FT always gets something like that. But they didn't leak the other bit. They didn't leak the bit that said that actually higher inflation means tax receipts are much better and that black hole doesn't exist. And I think that was clearly misleading and deliberate.
And what she couldn't do is square the language of political choices she lent so heavily on in her budget speech with that reality. Because she talks, Rachel Reeves, as if she's doing things out of necessity. We're all going to have to make a contribution, etc., etc. The reality of this is, okay, she wasn't in an amazing fiscal position. She still needed more headroom. But what she has chosen to do, because of her weak political position among the Parliamentary Labour Party, first and foremost, and yes, there's a bit of political morality mixed in there as well, is do something quite shifty on working people, i.e. freeze the thresholds, something she was going to overturn by the end of this Parliament because she said it was an injustice and shortchange working people, to increase welfare payments, which, by the way, unlike those tax thresholds, are linked to inflation. That's a very difficult political choice to defend, lifting the two-child cap while freezing everybody else's tax thresholds and clobbering more people with income tax and all the rest of it. To do that from a sort of position of fiscal strength is even more unpalatable. So no wonder she couldn't be entirely straight or give us the full story, because then I think the political choices she's made, which is what they are even harder to defend. So she's in this weird position of saying, we chose to do this, and the Prime Minister said it as well. We chose to do this because we really want to do it, but also times are really tough and we have to take tough decisions. And they're caught between those two messages. And I think that goes some way to explaining why they couldn't be completely straight. The Parliamentary Labour Party wouldn't accept anything less than lifting the two-child cap, but the fiscal reality, left them in a better position than it looked.
I mean, politics has become more meta than ever before. Some people knew as Reeves was rolling the pitch in this somewhat unorthodox way earlier in November what it was that she was trying to do. We knew that she was bracing the public and her party for something that overtly departed from the manifesto. But then when she didn't do it, it sort of only exposed the expediency and political considerations at the heart of it. And I think as well, I mean, it's kind of interesting. This weekend, Number 10 was saying that those quibbling with, the perceived mismatch between her statements and the OBR's reporting didn't understand maths, that we were innumerate and illiterate, and that this was all disingenuous. I also think that it probably taps into a wider theme, which is the sort of reduced value of words themselves when it comes to the Treasury. I think that, we actually had lunch with somebody a couple of weeks ago who was saying to us that this project has such a slippery relationship with words, and they almost seem to think that, when it comes to political vocabulary, you can kind of say some things and then kind of recant them later and the public doesn't notice. And for instance, their insistence that this doesn't breach the manifesto, when in actual fact people know that they are paying more tax because of the freezing thresholds. Well, I think that they think that there is greater value attached to their own words than the public does, and it sort of deepens this existing sense that what the Chancellor says and then the letter of her own policy are not always the same two things.
Yeah, the age where you can get away with pointing to some specific phrasing in a manifesto, if that age ever existed. After the budget, so many ministers, I'm thinking of James Murray, Chief Secretary to Treasury, Bridget Phillipson, Education Secretary, right? Both are on the media rounds after the budget, in the days after the budget. I don't say this to single them out, just the interviews I remember. And they're asked the same question again and again. You said you weren't going to raise income tax, but for a lot of people, that is now true. They're going to be paying more income tax as a result of a decision the Chancellor has made. And both of them, this was clearly the line to take, said, well, hang on, no. If you read the manifesto, it said we're not going to increase the rates of income tax. So actually, we haven't broken the manifesto. Now, the problem is, a bit like Keir Starmer saying in 2020, hey guys, I'm Jeremy Corbyn in a suit. That's all right. Or Keir Starmer saying in 2024, this is a changed Labour Party. We're not going to behave as you think the Labour Party is going to behave. We've been reprogrammed by Morgan McSweeney and some other bright people. Actually, if you then proceed to do the opposite, even if you can find a document somewhere that says, no, I think you'll find that we are in the letter, if not the spirit of this, voters are not going to say, oh, well, since the Chief Secretary of the Treasury has just said it on the World at One, fair enough, I don't feel angry about it anymore. And that is the political problem there.
So look, we should ask the bigger question in relation to that and the question of truth, which is where does this leave Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer? And I wanted to give you a little insight into our craft, our job. So normally when you do, something happens in journalism and you try to ring round ministers and cabinet ministers, and it's actually really hard work. You're trying to get people on the phone, bump into them in places and get their reaction to an event. In the wake of this budget and in the wake of Friday, when it was revealed that the black hole didn't exist, it was actually one of the most straightforward weekends of journalism I've ever had, because people voluntarily, cabinet ministers, senior ministers, started just getting in touch to say, we feel like we were misled, we're really angry about this. And we splashed that story on Monday, this kind of very unhappy cabinet, that the cabinet itself felt misled by the Chancellor. And what I would say more broadly is when you get to that point, when you get to the stage where ministers are making very clear that they are unhappy, you're slightly in the kind of, it feels to me in reporting terms, like the end of days territory. It was like when Boris Johnson all folded and the briefings started flooding in. People are very unhappy. So look, we have a high tax, high welfare budget, as Patrick said, which is probably enough to win over Labour backbenchers and Labour MPs, but you have a very unhappy cabinet who are really concerned about what's happening. And that's why May, when we get these elections, is going to be really messy, and that pressure is going to start to tell more and more.
But the interesting question, Steve, is it enough to win over Labour backbenchers? Because we know about these Labour backbenchers. They're not the backbenchers of a changed Labour Party. They're fickle. They have a low pain threshold. And what's been interesting is, yes, they all felt great about themselves on Wednesday because they lifted the 2-child cap, etc., etc. I think unease is beginning to creep back in. Some of them have spent the weekend on the doorstep getting kicked in the face by their constituents over the taxes they're paying and realising actually this isn't possibly a winning proposition in the country. Rachel Reeves is doing her best to sort of curry favour with these people. Minutes before Richard Hughes was sacked yesterday, she wrote in the WhatsApp group for Labour MPs and said, thanks, almost a veiled criticism of the cabinet ministers who've been briefing against us. Sort of thanks so much to all the supportive colleagues who are, out there at a time when some people don't want the government to succeed, but you, my supportive colleagues, I'm really, really grateful. And that's a massive WhatsApp group. And I'm told it got a couple of dozen likes out of, several hundred Labour MPs. So that is not a great indication of how popular the Chancellor is right now. It's a small straw in the wind. But you just know that if Labour MPs will not need another excuse to give the government a kicking. And I'm not saying that it's reverted to the mean of Labour MPs being completely feral, as one allowed Keir Starmer put it to me the other week. But, they are a hard crowd to keep on side. And it won't take much. It won't take much more political turbulence for, things to kick off again.
Definitely. We actually had some polling in the paper this weekend by More in Common, which said that it was the least well-off segment of the electorate, which in the most resounding numbers, said that they didn't think that the budget would address the cost of living crisis for them. And I had a little anecdote in my piece on Sunday about an encounter that Reeves had at a petrol station just leaving the West Midlands shortly after her visit with Starmer after the budget, in which a lorry driver came up to her, introduced himself, and sort of, I think, semi-sympathetically said, well, you can't please everybody, love. And I think that she said, you can't. He said, that's politics. But the question is, well, can you please the PLP? And in order to do that, you need to please the people whose grievances and complaints and anxieties they feel most acutely. And that is, in many instances, the people who are supposed to be the beneficiaries of the budget, and in particular, the lifting of the 2-child cap, whether they feel they're benefiting when sort of wider effect of the budget is pretty corrosive when it comes to growth. That's another question. And it should be said, however totemic the 2-child cap is, if you're going back to your constituency week after week, run up to Christmas and into the new year ahead of the locals and hearing the same thing, the mood changes rapidly. There's no commitment on the PLP's behalf that they'll now, gingerly retreat backwards and won't come back to Reeves with more complaints or demands in the new year.
Because, of course, the thing that we all forget is that it's popular amongst Labour MPs, the 2-child cap being lifted. But as Rachel Reeves knew, and her aides had certainly been briefing for a long period of time beforehand, it isn't actually popular with the public. And again, as Patrick was saying, if you combine that with the fact that people are going to be paying more tax, there is a risk there, isn't there, that people do kind of pick up on this line that Kemi Badenoch sort of spouted about, it's a return to benefit street. And, I think that whilst there is a rearguard action going on at the moment, and people explaining very clearly that, around 70% of those people that will benefit from this announcement are actually in work, I think that that is something that is still going to irk some people, that, they are paying essentially to pay a bigger and bigger and larger welfare bill. But I was really fascinated to see your story about the cabinet in particular, because it does feel a bit like what you were saying as well a few weeks ago, Gabriel, that it is just these constituents, these kind of 3 constituents of the electorate, the backbenchers and the cabinet, and you're kind of juggling those 3 balls all the time, and you can only make one of them happy all at once. And it seems whilst the backbenchers might be slightly happier this week, the cabinet aren't. And I do kind of wonder whether anything has fundamentally changed, because I do think that situation that we had only a couple of weeks ago, I think when there was that incredible briefing against Wes Streeting, and the sense I got from cabinet ministers that were calling me that weekend was that they were worried about who was going to be next. They felt that kind of camaraderie, that unity, that we're all in it together, however difficult it is out there, we are a unit that can kind of face this down. There was a sense then that Number 10 could easily throw any one of them under a bus at any given moment, if it was politically expedient to do so. And I do wonder if that will be the beginning of the kind of real fracture in cabinet.
We are going to talk about the return of Brexit to the forefront of British politics. So last night we had Keir Starmer standing in his kind of finest outfit and gave a speech in which he said that people made wild promises about Brexit, promises that were never fulfilled. Now, why are we talking about Brexit again? Why are we back here? The reason is because Keir Starmer and Labour think there is an opportunity here. If you look at some YouGov polling, it suggests that 6 in 10 people want a closer relationship with the European Union. And so they sense a political opportunity that if you castigate those who delivered Brexit, and specifically one guy who they say walked away, Nigel Farage, there are political points to be made here. And this is against the backdrop of negotiations with Brussels have kicked off again. Those talks are happening at the moment about a youth mobility scheme, which could see about 50,000 young people from Europe come to the UK every year. There are also further talks on kind of removing some of the frictions. But there's also huge risks to this. If you reopen the Brexit Pandora's box, it can get pretty vitriolic pretty quickly.
I mean, it's fascinating to see that this has become a thing again. But I mean, look, I don't think this particular discussion is going to go away. My understanding is that the Liberal Democrats are going to kind of weaponise this as a subject. I can see that there is a 10-minute rule, which is a rather arcane legislative procedure, which is on the order paper for next Tuesday, which has been put down by Sir Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, when they are going to try and push to a vote the idea of rejoining the customs union. I think pretty much specifically with the aim in mind of flushing out Labour MPs to see who might come out and actually say that they support it. And I've was sent a letter this morning that's gone to Labour MPs from the Liberal Democrats urging them to back this particular legislative procedure, which, I mean, I must say, I can't remember a single time when it's ever become legislation when it started in the 10-minute rule, although I'm sure, Patrick, even with your history, is there one?
I'm all out. I'm all out.
It's usually sort of symbolic, but
Yes,
it can be used as a tactic to create mischief. But it could have legs this time, because if you see large swathes of Labour MPs either coming into the chamber to talk about it, or if they do manage to force it to a vote, it could be quite interesting.
That is a delicate line they're trying to tread. What they are trying to do is to say Labour backs Brexit, the right kind of Brexit with fewer frictions. But what we don't want to do is rejoin the customs union. And the problem is, as we learned at the weekend, when you've got Starmer's most senior economic advisor, a woman called Manoush Shafiq, suggesting that privately behind doors as a way to boost growth, it got killed, nixed, that's not going to happen. But nonetheless, that is the very delicate line that they're treading here.
Yeah, the government's a walking contradiction on this, because you have the Prime Minister campaigning on a platform of make Brexit work. Just over a year in, he and his Chancellor are sort of half saying, I think it's important not to overstate their political courage here. You know, they sort of say it, then they shrink back from it, right? So Keir Starmer said that at the Lord Mayor's banquet last night. Wow, he's gone to the City of London, said Brexit was a mistake. That's really, really brave. You know, try doing it in, you know, Grimsby or Hull or wherever. You know, the Chancellor says, oh, you know, Brexit has really hit our productivity figures. She barely spoke about Brexit by the time of the budget. You know, we were basically told the whole budget's going to be in a full frontal assault on Nigel Farage and his role in Brexit. That didn't happen. You've got the Prime Minister's chief economic advisor behind closed doors saying, why don't we rejoin the customs union? Then you've got the business department and Peter Mandelson, the late Peter Mandelson, when he was ambassador, spending a lot of time taking advantage of Britain's place outside the EU to negotiate an advantageous trade deal. You've got an AI policy that is built on Britain being out of the EU. You've got planning policy taking advantage of not being bound by EU regulations, right? And then you've also got one of Keir Starmer's closest allies, Nick Thomas-Symonds, the Paymaster General, in the Cabinet Office, spending most of his time negotiating a closer economic relationship with the EU. You've got the youth mobility scheme that Rachel Reeves was desperate to get the OBR to score as a growth measure. And then you've got the Home Office under Rebecca Cooper and Shabana Mahmood saying, whoa, why are you out there saying, please, can we have a potentially open-ended number of immigrants, right? So almost everything the government does on the EU and on Brexit, you can find a counterexample in policy terms that cuts across it. And there is no central sort of narrative on Brexit. That's the problem. And you can say that for lots of things, but at no point other than as a political expedient, I think, have they ever really engaged with the question of Brexit and what it means and what it could mean for Britain's economic model. Instead, as they bounce from political problem to political problem, they find a new stance on Brexit, or Brexit and the EU are useful in different ways. So it's a bit of a mess, I think.
I think that's right. I'd say the other thing is, in journalism, we are particularly attuned to contradictions and hypocrisy. Politicians can, endowed with the correct skills, reconcile contradictions or have them coexist, but use rhetoric and vocabulary to weld them together and ask the public to go along with it. And Boris Johnson being the most famous example, he was the London mayor who was a great spokesman for the cosmopolitanism of our great city and who believed in migration, who spoke about his Turkish ancestry. And then he was the Heineken politician who went to places that Tories wouldn't go in order to persuade people to vote for Brexit. So you can have politicians that can transcend what appear to be intellectual contradictions as long as they actually appear to be able to own them. And Starmer's problem has been that because of his position when he was Shadow Brexit Secretary, he was correctly deemed by most people to want to inch the Labour Party back towards a Remain position. So there's always this notion that he sort of says one thing but ultimately wants to give effect to another. And when you couple that with his own ambivalence on how to take on reform, we've spoken about this on the pod before, sometimes he says they're racist, Other times it seems he says, perhaps they're not morally objectionable, but they're the politics of grievance and it wouldn't work.
Yeah.
And that's what this is, by the way. I mean, that is essentially what he said yesterday. It's not that, Brexit is intrinsically bad. What was he saying at Guildhall, by the way, wearing white tie and almost looking like a laboratory-grown version of the critique that, Farage and others put forward about him. He was saying that, it was the promises, the nature of the Brexit advanced by Farage, which wasn't acceptable, to which I think the obvious rejoinder from Farage is, I wasn't in government thereafter. I'm just not sure it's very persuasive.
That's the point, because they wanted to pick Farage as the guy that delivered Brexit, then walked away and took no responsibility for it. But actually, I think for Farage, that is a potential strong point, because he can say, I had nothing to do with the way it was delivered. The way it was delivered was hugely problematic. That is the Tories' fault. And then he can say, when I'm in number 10, I will sweep away all these problems. I will redefine our relationship with the EU, which is broadly the pitch he's making.
Yeah. And also, Farage's view is Europe is turning towards the radical right, or parties of the right with which Farage is aligned or familiar from his time in the European Parliament, or otherwise sort of politically simpatico. So he would say, look, if you want people to have a conversation in this change Europe, I'm your guy. And the second thing Reform's leadership have spoken to me about a few times is, can you necessarily sell turning back to the EU at a time where, on occasion, it's not averse to taking a particularly aggressive trade stance against the UK? It put tariffs on UK steel the other day. That was manna from heaven politically for Reform, who have made steel one of their big iron bars with which to beat Labour. So they think the politics of this are not as straightforward for the Labour Party as they look. That the EU are not necessarily the good guys in the eyes of the electorate that we might think.
One thing's for sure, we are not in a 52-48 world anymore, right? The politics of Brexit has changed. The big discussions around migration now are about actually non-EU migrants, because that was the big change under the post-Brexit regime. And there's been a significant shift in the way it is today. I think that about brings us to an end this week. If you want to email us, if you want to get in touch, please drop us a line at thestateofit@thetimes.co.uk. That's thestateofit@thetimes.co.uk. We'd love to hear from you. And we'll obviously be back next week in full force, back with Caroline again. Delighted to have you back on board. Gabriel, can you pay tribute to our excellent producers, please?
Absolutely. Molly Guinness, Euan Dawtrey, thank you so much. And we'll see you in a week's time.